Thank you for joining us today. We have a very timely and relevant seminar today, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, what drinking water utilities need to know. And it's kind of a information about the bill and how to associate yourself with the bill and to get the most out of it. Our speaker today is Tommy Holmes, who is the Legislative Director of the American Water Works Association. And Tom has been with the American Water Works Association since 1990 and went through the ladders since. And he represents now the American Water Works Association's interests in the on the Hill and manages the association's grassroots congressional communications and monitors the legislation of interest to the drinking water community. He by himself, he is a previous Capitol Hill aide, so he knows the way to the Hill and on the Hill. And this is very useful to his work as a legislative director in Washington, D.C. So with no more delays, the floor is yours, Tom, and thank you very much for agreeing to be part of our seminar series.
Well, thank you, Ariel, and thank you, University of California, Riverside, for inviting AWWA to be a part of this important series on a webinar series on water. I do have a PowerPoint, but I promise not to sit here and read bullets to you. I just use those as guideposts. So if you bear with me a second, I will pull this up and let's see. Come on. It worked fine just a second ago from beginning. We'll just go there. All right. I'm going to talk about the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. And of course, the American Water Works Association is the world's oldest and largest nonprofit science and education association serving drinking water utilities. So the drinking water sector will be my primary focus. About 60% of our utility members are dual utilities in that they have they are part of a division of drinking water and a division of wastewater. But at AWWA, we focus on drinking water and pay a little bit of attention to wastewater because it is important to our members and they are upstream from us. Now, the bipartisan, let's see, it's called, the official title is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021. As it was going through the legislative process, it was HR 3684, but its nickname this past fall was the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, Deal, Law, Act. And now that it's a part of the law, it's Public Law 117-58. And I mention that number in case you need to go look it up. There is a website, if you're not already aware, called congress.gov. And that is a great place to look up legislation and track legislation. Anyway, the bipartisan bill, for short, addresses many types of infrastructure. It's about 1,038 pages. A lot of fun reading there. Fortunately for me, only about 58 pages deals with municipal drinking water and wastewater. So that was a relief. But still, it's not an easy read. So water infrastructure is what we're focusing on. Now, if you remember from civics class, for a federal program to exist and distribute money, there's a two-step process. First, Congress has to, and the president has to sign legislation authorizing the program or reauthorizing it if it's an existing program that must be continued. Authorizing legislation comes first. It creates the program, sets its limits, sets spending limits, and things like that. But there's no money released at that point. For the money to become released, Congress must pass and the president must sign appropriations legislation. So it's a little two-step here for money to get out the door for a new program or an existing program. What's unique about the bipartisan infrastructure, many things are unique, but the structural unique thing about that is in the water side, it has an authorization section and an appropriations section. And I will focus first and primarily on the appropriations because that is the actual release of money. So, appropriations, the big thing here, because it's such a public health concern at this point in time, and because it's the biggest slug of money, is $15 billion for the removal of lead service lines. Now, this chunk of money and most of the other money coming through the appropriations part of this bill are being channeled through either the drinking water or the wastewater state revolving loan fund program. The reason Congress did that is because it takes a long time to set up a new federal program. The SRF is already in existence. The drinking water SRF has been around since 1996, the wastewater program since 1986. And they already have the structures in place for soliciting contracts, evaluating contracts, and distributing money. The way the SRF works, it's like a lot of environmental law, it works under primacy in that once states adopt regulations at least as strict as the federal regulations, the states administer that program. I think all but one state in the United States has primacy to administer drinking water regulations. So state agencies administer the SRF. EPA in Washington distributes allocations of funds, but it's administered at the state level. This money's coming through the drinking water SRF. Now, the traditional SRF requires that states put up a 20% match of funds in order to receive the federal funds. What's unique about this chunk of money here for lead service lines is there's no requirement for states to provide matching funds, and there's no cost share requirements at the local end. Now, 49% of these funds are to be distributed in the form of loans with principal forgiveness or grants. I know that sounds kind of convoluted. Loans with principal forgiveness. Think of that as a grant with less paperwork. The real financial technicians can explain that, but it's an additional subsidy. The SRF already provides very low interest rate loans. This loans with principal forgiveness is a way to keep the cost of a project even lower for the local utility. Now, what's really good about this program is not only can you use it to remove lead service lines, but the funds can also be used to identify your lines. Where are they? You might have a good idea where they are because of the historical patterns of infrastructure construction in your community, but you really don't know till you dig up that line and scratch it. So the funds can be used for identification and then planning and design of your lead service line removal program. This bill is a 5-year bill, and this $15 billion is going to be released in chunks of $3 billion annually for each federal fiscal year. Now, those of you who have been following this issue are probably aware that a couple of years ago, AWWA commissioned a study or an attempt to get an inventory of the United States lead service lines. That study was done by an independent contractor, determined that there were at least 6.1 million lead service lines in the United States. And if you apply the numbers for removing an individual line, and I know they varied greatly from New York City to Muleshoe, Texas, we came up with an estimate that it will cost at a minimum $60 billion to remove the nation's lead service lines. And more likely, it's going to be much more than that. That's to remove lines that are going to be covered by the revised lead and copper rule. That rule is going to be having utilities remove not only lead service lines, but galvanized pipe that's downstream from a lead service line because of its ability to capture and then release lead. And it has some lead in it as well. So when this bill became law, some trade press reporters called me, and their questions, they didn't say it directly, but their questions amounted to, aren't you irate that Congress didn't provide the full $60 billion? I said, no, I'm not going to be ungrateful for $15 billion. And besides, frankly, if $80 billion were to fall out of the sky tomorrow, removal of the nation's lead service lines would be a very long-term project. Because not only do you first have to figure out how to distribute this money administratively, you figure out, all right, who needs this money? How much do they need? How do we distribute this equitably? How do we provide oversight to make sure these funds are spent correctly? But in addition, you've got to have men and women out on the street digging up lines or pulling lines, burying new replacement lines or inserting them, depending on the technology they use. Then you're going to go into the dwelling, pressure test the system, and look for any other plumbing fixtures that may be contributing to lead contamination. So this is a long-term project. But in the meantime, engineering students probably know, corrosion control, when administered correctly, does provide good protection against lead. Now, we do want to eventually remove all the lead service lines, and in the interim, exercising corrosion control can provide a lot of protection. Now, other appropriations of note in this, as I said, the SRF program has been around for a few years now. The drinking water SRF has been receiving about $1.126 billion a year in recent years. This money provides $1.26 billion annually through 2026 to the SRF. That's not a dramatic bump, but it's nice. However, Congress also, in this bill, provided an additional $11.7 billion over the next 5 years to the drinking water SRF. And half of that, as you can see here, is going to be in the form of additional subsidies, grant or loan with principal forgiveness. And in the first 2 years, states only have to provide a 10% match. One reason that state match is significant beyond the outlay of funds is this match requires action by a state legislature in almost every state, probably every state. Therefore, there could be a real time lag, or we may have some rebellion in some states against providing this match. So, not requiring a state match or just asking for a reduced state match is a big deal. Now, this bill also reauthorized a program we're very fond of, WIFIA, the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act. It was enacted in 2014. AWWA led efforts to get it enacted. It began making loans in 2017. Remember what I said about how long it takes to stand up a new federal program. This leverages federal dollars. So even though there's only $50 million annually for WIFIA, the way WIFIA works, every dollar Congress appropriates results in $100 being loaned out roughly. It operates similar to a transportation program called TIFIA. It sells treasury bonds, and so 100 times 50 million is going to be available for loans. Now, the difference between WIFIA and the SRF is WIFIA is designed for large-scale projects that are too large for the traditional SRF loan. On average, a drinking water SRF loan is $2 million. WIFIA makes loans for projects that cost at least $20 million. But you can hit that pretty quickly. A rough estimate is it costs about $1 million a mile to replace a water main through the average American city. Now, furthermore, appropriations that are significant in this bill, $4 billion to address emerging contaminants with a focus on PFAS, or per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. I finally learned to spell that without help. I was proud of that. Again, no match, state match or cost share required. Then an additional $5 billion to address any emerging contaminant in economically distressed communities. Economically distressed is a legal term of art that's worked out on the state level. So I can't tell you exactly how it works in California, but there is a definition in California for an economically distressed community. Now I mentioned there was appropriations and authorizations. There are other appropriations, especially for wastewater, but there's an authorization or two I do want to mention here. You might recall that in the past couple of years, there's been a lot of national focus on providing assistance to low-income water customers who need help paying their bills. And in fact, last spring, the ARPA, the Pandemic Relief Bill, did provide money to help low-income folks pay their water bills. It was being administered through Department of Health and Human Services, mainly because HHS already has experience administering an energy assistance program known as LIHEAP. So they figured HHS could get that money moving quicker than EPA could. But what they did in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, they did two things regarding low-income customers. First, there is to be a nationwide assessment of the needs of low-income water customers. Congressional staff told us that they still had a lot of questions on how to best serve low-income folks. Like, how do you deal with renters in a big apartment building who don't directly pay their water bill? Their water bill may be a part of their rent. So how can you provide them assistance? They want to know. However, there were demands by citizen activist groups that there be immediate assistance to low-income folks having trouble with their water bills. So a compromise was struck. There's two steps in here is a political compromise. We're going to be doing a nationwide assessment, and at the same time, EPA is to roll out 40 pilot projects at the community level. What's interesting is I told you the money provided last spring is being run through HHS. In the future, assistance to low-income customers is most likely going to be run through EPA, even though EPA really doesn't have experience with social services programs. The reason it's being done through EPA is congressional committees don't want to give up jurisdiction. And specific committees have jurisdiction over programs at EPA, and they don't want to give it up. So in the future, low-income assistance is going to be run through EPA in consultation, I assume, with HHS and the folks who run LIHEAP. Another big thing to pay attention to in the bipartisan infrastructure law is this provision called Build America, Buy America. Over the years, we've seen various domestic production, domestic purchase requirements put on infrastructure legislation. It started in the 30s under a concept called Buy American with an N on the end that said purchases by the federal government, must be, they must make purchases of domestically produced products except in certain circumstances. Buy America emerged in the 1980s, I believe. And it says, when federal funds are assisting people in building stuff like in infrastructure programs at EPA or Department of Transportation, the stuff being used must be domestically sourced. Now, on the water side, we first experienced this back in 2008 in the American Recovery and Relief Act, where there was a domestic, purchase requirement put into funds coming out of that bill. Then after that, we transitioned to something called American Iron and Steel, and it said all the iron and steel products in your project, if it's receiving federal assistance, must be domestically sourced. Well, now we're in another iteration of all that, and it's more sweeping. It said domestic purchase requirements are now extended to manufactured products and construction materials. The committees of jurisdiction did not put this in there. I asked where this came from, and they wouldn't say. Anyway, that's a concern because we know there are certain valves that are not produced in this country, certain pipe fittings are not. SCADA panels, the electronic control panels for running a utility, may have parts in Germany, Switzerland, South Korea, subassembly in Mexico, but final installation, obviously, in the United States. So we're concerned about how this is going to work. Now, there is a waiver process, and I get mixed signals on that. I ask members of our association who are manufacturers how the waiver process works. And some of them say it takes too long, it's opaque, and it doesn't work well, and it is caused problems when after a couple of years we find out what we thought at the time was wrong about this particular part. And other manufacturing members say it works smoothly and great. So I think I was a part of a conference call this morning with other water associations, with officials from the the Office of Management and Budget and EPA. And we stressed the need for clear and timely guidance from EPA on the waiver process and on, the domestic purchase requirements. They're under legal obligation to provide some form of guidance by May 14th. So we'll see how that works. But we need a clear process that works in a timely manner. They have an interest in this working smoothly as well, because it's in the administration's interest for these funds to start flowing to local communities. So I'm cautiously optimistic that things will work out here, but we're going to have to monitor this closely. Another area of interest in all this is cybersecurity. That's been in the news a lot the past year because of a couple of breaches that fortunately did not cause, harm to public health. But this bill requires that EPA and the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, it's called CISA for short, and it's a part of DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. They are to identify public water systems that if they got hacked, it would cause a major public health threat. And those agencies are to develop some sort of technical assistance for them. And then the last part is kind of concerning. They're to provide Congress a list of public systems that are vulnerable. And the fact that you would publish a list of good targets is a little concerning. So hopefully there'll be some confidentiality preserved there, or that by the time this list is published, these systems will be hardened. As I said earlier, Congress, and you've probably gathered this from my remarks, has dumped a whole lot of work on EPA and subsequently to state SRF programs. So when utilities have come to me, and frankly, that in that 4-day period between Congress passing the thing and the president signing, I started getting emails and phone calls from a lot of utilities asking, how do I apply? And I had some advice to give them, and fortunately, EPA told me later that I said the right thing, so that's always happy. What what I am telling people is first, decide which pot of money you want to prioritize your efforts toward. Is it the lead service line replacement? Is it emerging contaminants? Is it resiliency funds? Is it technical assistance? Or do you have basic infrastructure needs that you want to address through the traditional SRF? But decide what are your number 1, 2, and 3 targets on that pot of funds. Then go to your state SRF agencies and establish a relationship or reestablish a relationship and let them know, I want to apply for, my utility wants to apply for these funds when the time comes to apply. Ask, what do I need to do to get ready to apply? And that could be get on their intended use plan and whatever task that entails, get your design, your project designs in order, start working on your environmental permits and building permits. That's not exactly, ask them what you need to do. I can't tell you what you need to do in your state or your municipality. But start the dialogue with your state SRF agency and get on their radar for these funds. And we expect to see some guidance, at least some guidance from EPA by late February on this. Hopefully we'll get a little bit more information sooner. AWWA is building a website dedicated to implementation of the IIJA. So hopefully, if you visit that page regularly, we'll have information on that. It hasn't gone live yet. I've provided a lot of materials. I'm hoping they can get it up next week. I'm going to push for that, but we are working on that. Now, I will mention that you might have seen an announcement from EPA on December 2nd last month. EPA released its state-by-state allotments for the first tranche of funds coming out of this bill. And the way they wrote the release, it sounded like the funds were coming that day, but that's not the case. They were announcing how they were to be allocated among the states. What's significant about these funds, these are funds that do not require a state match. So it's not all the money appropriated, but it's that money which does not require the state match. So that means, it does mean though, that's the $3 billion in this fiscal year for lead service line replacement. 1.9 billion for the traditional SRF, 800 million for emerging contaminants and so on. So, there's significant money coming in this fiscal year. Now, I do have to mention the Build Back Better bill. That is the big infrastructure and social program bill that's such a hot topic in Congress these days. Now, I can't believe I say this, but we have a relatively small piece of that, only $9 billion. If that bill is to pass, if that bill does pass, it may contain an additional $9 billion for lead service line replacement in economically distressed communities. Plus, it would provide the actual cash for the low-income assistance pilot program that I mentioned a few minutes ago that was just authorized. So I am somewhat confident that, as they start chopping away pieces of this to get it passed, they will leave the water piece alone because we're a relatively small part of it. And it's hard to argue with lead service line replacement and helping out low-income folks. But the outlook for this package as a whole is unclear. So, I don't know what's going to happen with that. And I'll just mention briefly, there are a whole lot of authorizations. I'm not going to read all these bullets. I'm just going to throw them on the screen so that you can see. Here are some of the authorizations for drinking water. You see, there's significant pots of money. I point this out, it's going to be incumbent upon all of us to remind Congress in the coming years that they authorized all this stuff. So when you get into the appropriations cycle, we'd like to see this money actually flow out. The wastewater side, here's some of the appropriations they got, and They are significant. I don't think they're quite as dramatic as the drinking water ones, but they did get significant appropriations. And I will make the slide deck. I will send it to folks, the staff at UC Riverside. They can have it and distribute it to you. Significant authorizations on the wastewater side. And again, emerging contaminants is a big issue. Helping people on septic systems connect to a central system is a part of that. And it's only $200 million, but we've got to get people off septic if we're going to control, sewage outflows in the environment. More, a lot of water authorizations in here. And that's how you can contact me if you have further questions. There are, in the Washington office, we have 8 people engaged in advocacy. We have, 4 regulatory staff, 2 legislative staff, that's me and Nate. And then we have a head of government affairs, Tracy Meehan, and an office coordinator. And if you have questions on legislative affairs, you can contact me or Nate. Nate's specialization is appropriations, and mine is infrastructure. And it's getting to be in a lot of other things. So with that, I'll turn things back over to our host. And the air is dry here on the East Coast. I got to keep sipping water here.
Thank you very much, Tommy. This was super interesting. Now we open it for questions from audience. If you can raise your hands, I can unmute you to ask the question, or just type it in the chat and we can read it for Tommy. I don't see any questions right now, but let's see if anyone can start. Do you have a question for Tommy? You are muted.
I have two questions, but
go ahead. Go ahead. Yes, let's just start with your questions.
Tommy, this is a very interesting window for us in the academia to realize, what is going on in the real world. I have actually 2 questions. One question is about, maybe it's a little bit more theoretical too. In your slides, we saw so many allocations to different types of spending or different types of problems. Was there a process? How was the process that led to that distribution of that funds to each of these important items?
That is, I'll start. At AWWA, we've been advocating for the nation to reinvest in its water infrastructure for over a decade. And it is, been building and building and building. So, the core infrastructure stuff, I take some pride in the fact that it's now kind of a given in this United States that we need to reinvest in the nation's water infrastructure. That's one component. But there are different associations here in Washington engaged in water. Now, AWWA is the oldest and the largest. Our membership includes small, medium, large water systems, public and private. And we have a category of membership for manufacturers, but we're a utility-dominated association. There is an association representing rural water systems. There's an association representing water use. There's an association representing large metropolitan drinking water agencies. There's an association for large metropolitan sewerage agencies. There are an association representing state administrators. And so all of these associations come to the Hill and they say, this is definitely important to all of us. And poor congressional staff has to sit down and they have hearings and everyone says their piece and they say, okay, WIFIA and emerging contaminants and lead service line replacement are reporting to AWWA and the Association of Metropolitan Water Agencies, and assistance to small systems and rural systems and economically distressed systems is important to rural water. And, the sewerage guy, the wastewater guys have their own thing. So all these different interests come to the Hill and say, this is important. And congressional staff sifts through that. And then they hold public hearings and they place a priority. Also, members of Congress, they do go home to their home district or home state every weekend. They probably ought to stay in DC more. But they do go back home and they hear from their constituents and their local mayors that, look, we've got to replace 40 miles of lead service line. We need help. And so when they hear from their local elected officials, that has a big impact. Various interest groups do come to Congress and say, this is what's important. And now with this bill, there was a multi-step process. I told you all the names for the bipartisan infrastructure law. And even before that, the Senate had a bill, S914, the Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act, that it passed last summer. And the drinking water and wastewater text of the bipartisan bill were basically a copy and paste of S914. So that's what that came from. The Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works has jurisdiction over drinking water and wastewater. It put together S914. And then when congressional leaders got together to put together the bipartisan bill, they just did a copy and paste of S914 for the water component. And we were happy with that. That was a bipartisan bill that passed pretty easily.
Yeah, this is what I expected that happened, because this is usually the case of interest groups trying to lobby and to promote their interests.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll explain. AWWI, I said there's 8 of us in DC doing advocacy. Our headquarters is in Denver, and we have 150 people there who do professional development programs, conferences, educational programs, publications. They do, all kinds of member support and professional development. And they develop the standards for treatments and processes. In fact, we do the manual for how to treat drinking water in the United States.
Yeah. My second question is actually a practical question. So I don't know what is needed from a given utility in order to submit a request or a proposal for getting funds. What are the forms? What are the studies that they need to provide? But from my experience, I know that some bills like that or projects like that of public funding can be very detrimental to small groups or small utilities that don't have the capacity to produce those background studies. So is that something that was taken into account, that, and maybe those small utilities are the ones who are mainly in need for those funds to improve their ability to cope with, the deteriorating infrastructure, with climate change, and with all of that?
I would say one of the biggest concerns in this country is these very small utilities that don't have the customer base to have the funds to deal with increasingly complex regulations and aging infrastructure. There is technical assistance in this bill for such systems. And there is, I mentioned the National Rural Water Association focuses exclusively on providing technical assistance and getting funds. Most of their work is in getting funds for small rural systems. They have a circuit rider program that travel, they have individuals travel around to different small systems to provide technical assistance. And they get, this is funny, they get some money from Congress. Congress doesn't say $50 million will go to the Rural Water Association for this. What they say is, $200 million will go to a national organization with an existing circuit rider program to provide technical assistance. Well, that's them. They do a good job, so I'm not begrudging them that. There are programs to help small systems, but yeah, it's true, more needs to be done. And we're having discussions at AWWA and with EPA on how do we get the word down to the small, or it could be a poor suburban system that doesn't have the technical and financial capability to even apply for these funds. They hire a consultant or put a consultant on retainer to walk them through the process, but that's an additional expense as well. Now, one thing that needs to be done in this country, and it is happening to an increasing degree, we need to look at to an increasing degree on partnerships. And I choose that word carefully. In the past, we used to use the word consolidation, and that immediately put people on the defensive. Partnerships is a spectrum of activities, and it can be everything from a takeover or consolidation to a sharing of technical managerial expertise to cooperating on bulk purchases of supplies. I mean, there are degrees. I think the state of California has gotten more aggressive. The state agency in California has gotten more aggressive on forcing partnerships or consolidations. I know the state of Kentucky has gotten very aggressive. We have a lot of small, non-viable systems in this country. And we need to form some form of partnership amongst those, or partner those folks with a neighboring large utility. Part of the challenge, there's several challenges though. Part of it is geography. You know, what if you have a mountain range between two utilities? That's not practically expertise. You may have a large city that is well run and in compliance, and next to it is a suburb that is having trouble complying with the Safe Drinking Water Act, contaminant regulations, or whatever regulations. So if that large system takes over the small system and they become one, suddenly that unified system is out of compliance. So you want to give the Good Samaritan a grace period to bring the smaller system into compliance. I know that has happened here on the East Coast in Pennsylvania, where one system took over another system and discovered, boy, their pipes are a basket case. We've got to rebuild half their system. And it was a bigger job than they realized. So we need partnerships, but it's not as simple as just hooking up pipes together.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Tommy. Anyone else, if you have a question, please let us know. We can unmute you, or you can just type it in the chat.
I will see AWWA does have a student member program, and the dues are pretty generous. And I would encourage you, we have an annual conference every June, and we'll have 10 to 12,000 water professionals there. This year it's in San Antonio, one of my favorite convention cities. And I most likely will be there. I go to every one of them. And sometimes we do mentoring programs. I did mentor a student from Oregon one year, and that worked out well. Yeah, I would encourage you all to look into student memberships at AWWA. We do have a robust young professionals program.
Yeah, there's a comment. This will be in YouTube, and if you email us, we will send you the link to the recording if you want to have access to it, Laura. All right. I don't see any more questions from the audience.
Well,
Thanks.
I was expecting some utilities to ask how to apply again, but like I said, talk to your SRF folks.
Yes, and I see some of our utilities in Southern California representatives attending the seminar. All right. Yeah, I think the recording will be available, right after we finish here. Thank you very much, Tommy, for sharing your expertise here, because I know a lot of utilities have questions, and as academia, we also have, it's just hard to understand all these 100+ pages, and then even the 50 page for the water part. So thank you very much for sharing that information with us.
Well, it's my pleasure.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I will send you the link to the recording, so if you want to share with anyone else in your network as well. Thanks, and we will see everyone else in February for our next seminar.